In the last video, we looked at shame and guilt and how our identification with them is linked to our belief in separation from God's oneness, otherwise known as love, or the Course uses the synonym knowledge for that oneness as well. So feeling separate from that oneness, that love, that ultimate comfort, we feel shameful and we feel guilty. We believe that we've done something wrong that has led to this separation from love, and we also feel that insignificant and incomplete now that we're no longer identified with the wholeness and the oneness, completeness that is a part of everything. So in this video, we'll be looking at the Course's path for undoing that shameful and guilty self-concept, thereby enabling us to once again experience that sense of wholeness and security associated with our true spiritual self. So forgiveness in the Course in Miracles is what undoes a shameful and guilty self-concept based on separation. Forgiveness as we generally know it, let's start with that, is somebody has hurt us or damaged us or offended us in some way. That's how we see it. You have done something egregious towards me, or somebody with whom I identify, or a group with whom I identify. And that's not a good thing. I feel bad, I feel distressed because what you have said or done. So the cause of my upset is you, is somebody else. But this is how the world sees forgiveness. I will pardon you. You've done a bad thing, you've hurt me, you've hurt people I identify with, but I'll pardon you. I'll not seek revenge, let's say, or something like that. Now, this is what lesson 134 in the Course has to say about this kind of forgiveness. So, lesson 134 is entitled, "Let me perceive forgiveness as it is." And this is from the first paragraph. "Let us review the meaning of forgive. For it is apt to be distorted," and he's talking about this kind of forgiveness, "for it is apt to be distorted and to be perceived as something that entails an unfair sacrifice of righteous wrath, a gift unjustified and undeserved, and a complete denial of the truth. In such a view, forgiveness must be seen as a mere eccentric folly, and this course," meaning A Course in Miracles, "appear to rest salvation on a whim." So this, as the Course says, if this really is forgiveness, and the Course says that forgiveness is what will lead us to inner peace, happiness, then this Course must be based on folly and a really unrealistic idea of what can lead to peace and happiness, because this kind of forgiveness where you say, I am a victim of the world, I am suffering because of what other people have done, and by suffering I'm not meaning what our body is going through, I mean that internal experience of lack of peace and the distress. When you are saying that I am a victim of the world I see in those terms, as the Course points out in other passages, you're saying you're a slave to the world, you're bound to the world, and this is like the antithesis of identifying with a spiritual eternal self, and that transcends the world. So if this is the kind of forgiveness that the Course is talking about, which it isn't, but if it was, this whole Course would seem like it's based on a fantasy. That it's a fantasy to think that forgiveness in these terms can lead to healing and inner peace. So leading into the course's definition of forgiveness, I'd like to talk about projection. And there's a great quote it's attributed to Anais Nin, the author of several novels, but it's also attributed to other people. So I don't know who came up with it first, but it is this. We don't see people as they are, we see them as we are. And that, I think, is a nice summary of the process of projection. If you feel triggered by somebody in a bad way, or spellbound by them, really attracted to them. So in other ways, if your emotions of desiring or loathing are triggered by what somebody does, by their appearance, by what they say, then that is an indicator that you have projected something of yourself onto that person. So in the case where we see somebody as having done a bad thing, we're upset about it and we're like, you hateful person, look at what you've done. That emotional reaction is an indicator that we have projected some self-identification onto that person. If we hadn't, then what they did, regardless of what it was, wouldn't cause or seem to be the cause of so much distress. So with this in mind, I'd like to read another paragraph from that same lesson, 134 in the course. So this is from paragraph 9. There is a very simple way to find the door to true forgiveness and perceive it open, wide in welcome. When you feel that you are tempted to accuse someone of sin in any form, do not allow your mind to dwell on what you think he did, for that is self-deception. Ask instead, would I accuse myself of doing this? So when we're upset by what someone has done or said, we feel distressed by it, perhaps we feel attacked by it, and we feel really hateful towards them. If we ask ourselves, would I condemn myself for doing this? Would I accuse myself of doing this? That's bringing back the projection. That's bringing back the projection of guilt onto them and the projection of shame onto them. Because ultimately, why we are upset is because we have identified as a separate self in the world, separate to God. We have identified with shame and guilt, and that is the cause of our distress. What the person has said and done is merely like a screen onto which we have projected the cause of our shame and guilt. So I can say, I don't feel distressed because I have identified with a shameful and guilty self. I feel upset because of what you have done, and now you're the shameful and guilty self. So if we're upset by what we see in somebody else, it's because we have seen the same thing within ourselves and we have condemned ourselves for it. And that's why we have a need to see it in the other person and condemn it in them. So in that instance, both of us need help. That other person needs help because they are acting unlovingly, and that is always because they are in a fear-based state from identifying as a separate self from God, and therefore with shame and guilt themselves. And we need help because we are also in that state, because we are distressed. We think it's because of what they've done, but it's actually because of what they are reflecting back to us about ourselves. We see ourselves in that person, and that is what distresses us. So the Course says, would I condemn myself for this? Would I accuse myself of this? Well, the fact is, yes, we already have somewhere in the past. We have. And we have also condemned ourselves for it. And the situation, therefore, provides an opportunity for healing for both of us, both us and the person we are dealing with. The Course says we're never healed alone. The arc of healing is entered 2 by 2, or the Course uses some metaphor like that. So, would I condemn myself for this? And then we ask for help. Help from the Holy Spirit, which is in the Course a symbol for a presence within our mind that bridges that gap between the shameful, guilty self we think we are and the spiritual self, the whole self, that is still residing within that oneness. The Holy Spirit is in touch with both of those. We're only in touch with the shameful, guilty one in those moments. And by asking for help from the Holy Spirit, that act of asking for help, what it's doing is it's just opening our mind to that connection with that memory of who we really are. And then that will help us to let go of that shame and guilt. And as we do that, we also feel less hatred and anger towards the other person. In other words, we begin to forgive the other person because we realize that their problem is the same as our problem, that we've both identified with a shameful, guilty self, and their call for help is the same as ours. We both want to feel ultimately a part of that love, that security. We both want to feel we're back at home where we really want to be. Lesson 23 provides some clear steps of forgiveness. The lesson is called I Can Escape from the World I See by Giving Up Attack Thoughts. So what it means by the world I see is one in which I feel a victim of forces beyond my control, where my peace, my sense of security is dependent on things that go on in the world. And that's a very vulnerable sense of security, a very vulnerable sense of self. And we can escape from that sense of self by forgiveness, by giving up our attack thoughts that somebody else is guilty, bad, for making us, inverted commas, making us feel a certain way. That is, if we undergo the following process of forgiveness, that's how we can get back in touch with our sense of invulnerability and security. So here are those steps. The idea for today introduces the thought that you are not trapped in the world you see because its cause can be changed. This change requires first that the cause be identified and then let go so that it can be replaced. The first 2 steps in this process require your cooperation. The final one does not. So, if we find ourselves distressed at what is going on in the world or what somebody does, the first step in forgiveness, that the cause of our distress be identified. So the first step is to say, it's not what is going on out there that is upsetting me. It's that I have identified with shame and guilt myself. I have identified with unworthiness, and if I identify with guilt, I fear punishment in some form from the world or from God ultimately. If I identify with shame, I'll fear some kind of abandonment or rejection. Either way, I feel insecure because I have identified with my wrong mind. If you remember from the previous video, I have identified with separation. That's why I feel bad right now. So that's the first thing. Identify the cause of your distress. Now the second step, then let go. So now I have to be willing, the letting go of the cause that I have identified with shame and guilt. Being willing to let that go means being willing to let the so-called cause of my distress, the one I thought was the cause, that person, that circumstance, being willing to let that off the hook, being willing to forgive, being willing to say, you are not the cause of my distress. My choice for the ego and the wrong mind is the cause of my distress. My own identification with shame and guilt is the cause of my fear and distress. That is what it means in the second step by willing to let go. So you identify as the cause, then you're willing to let it go. Then the third step is that it will be replaced. So our wrong-minded perceptions are then replaced by the Holy Spirit's vision. And the Holy Spirit's vision, which is it, the Holy Spirit is in touch with that spiritual self, therefore enables us to get in touch with our innocence and then perceive the innocence in the other person. Now the Course says in time, we are guilty in time, but not in eternity. So as bodies are guilty for doing things in the world. But the whole premise of the Course is that ultimately the world and what we do as bodies is illusory. But it's the presence of the Holy Spirit within our mind that is what we need to call on to get in touch with that reality of our innocent self, and therefore perceive the other person as more than their body, as more than their actions. And it's that will lead to inner peace. And it's that will lead to forgiveness, to no longer experiencing hateful feelings or accusing the other person of disturbing your peace, because now you experience that despite what they have done, you are experiencing peace right now. So their behaviour has not had an effect on you anymore anyway, at least not in this moment, now that you've forgiven them and you've also forgiven yourself for your self-accusation, for what you saw in them and what upset you. So this process of forgiveness is how the Course works with our resistance to letting go of the self identified with the past. What we talked about in the last video, our shame and guilt is so identified with the past, with our whole history and idea of ourselves, that we are afraid to let them go, because who would we be without them? We're afraid of the brave new world, of what comes next, and on some level we're afraid of annihilation. We perceive the end of shame and guilt and our identification with them as our own death. And this is all on an unconscious level, and so we are resistant to letting them go. But this process of forgiveness that the Course offers is a way of working with that resistance step by step. So as we're ready to let go of another aspect of shame and guilt, a situation, a relationship will present itself in which we find ourselves getting upset. And in that situation, that means that some more shame and guilt has come up to be processed and to be healed. Our distress is showing us, and how we view somebody else is showing us what needs to be healed, what next step in forgiveness we have arrived at. And that is how, bit by bit, the kind of barnacles of shame and guilt are taken off the mirror. We're cleaning the mirror that will eventually reflect back to us our wholeness, our spiritual self, our innocence. And with all of that in mind, I'll read out this short passage from the Course which talks about how forgiveness keeps gentle pace with us, with our resistance. So it's from chapter 16 and paragraph 8. Fear not that you will be abruptly lifted up and hurled into reality, which is like the fear that we have of our impending death as we let go of shame and guilt. What are we without it? Time is kind, and if you use it on behalf of reality, it will keep gentle pace with you in your transition. So, forgiveness is the way, in the Course's way, to respect our fear of letting go of the past, of our roles, of those roles, helper, fixer, rescuer, tyrant, whatever makes us feel good about ourselves in a very perverse kind of way. It doesn't lead to happiness ultimately. Forgiveness is the Course's path, and I hope you found this helpful. If you want to see another presentation with slides and images of forgiveness and of miracles, the Course's view of miracles that I have done, I'll pop them up here for you to click on. And these other presentations are slightly different to this one, but they can help also gently introduce you to the Course's idea of forgiveness and miracles and healing. Thanks for watching. God bless. Bye.